Now, the book's called Evolve Your Brain, The Science of Changing Your Mind. And the book is about what neuroscience has to say about the possibility of change. There's a concept in neuroscience called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity tells us that we're changed by every thought we think, everything we learn, every experience we have, every dream we embrace, that the brain is plastic throughout our entire lives, and it allows us to modify our behaviors to do a better job in life. So the book is about what change means, why it's so hard to change, and some possible techniques for people to begin to make measurable changes in their life. Well, a miracle is anything that happens outside of convention, whether it's social convention, religious convention, scientific convention, something that happens outside the current belief system of the time. And so when I studied spontaneous remissions of disease, I began to realize that some of these remissions weren't so spontaneous after all, that people actually had a very clear intention on what they wanted. They had the ability to connect with the spirit within them. They realized that they had to change some emotions that drove them to a lower denominator, that were highly addictive and connected to the stress chemicals. And they had to reinvent a new self. They had to become somebody else. And in the process of this contemplation of a new idea, they had moments where they lost track of time and space, where they actually disappeared. And that's the model of transformation that the book is about. In a very simplistic version, when we're talking about the model of thoughts and emotions and peptides, we basically have three types of chemicals that are in the brain and body, and they're called ligands, ligar meaning to bond. We have neurotransmitters. Those are those small chemicals that run throughout the brain that fire thoughts. When certain sequences fire in certain combinations, when the circuits fire in a certain way, they'll produce an emotional response that activates the midbrain that produces a set of peptides that correspond with the thought or the emotion of the person was thinking. Those second set of ligands, called neuropeptides, are pretty much the reason we feel the way we feel. Once those ligands are released into the bloodstream, peptides, they make their way to different hormonal centers and stimulate hormonal centers to produce the third type of ligand, which are the hormones that then produce different emotions, aggressive tendencies, sexual urges. And so when we have a thought, the thought produces a feeling. That feeling then signals the body for us to feel exactly the way we were just thinking. The moment we feel the way we think, we begin to think the way we feel. And this is where we get in trouble, because the redundancy of that cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking gets mind and body working together, or we create what's called the state of being. Now, that's idealistically a great way when we're looking at how the body becomes certain states of mind, but the difficulty is when it comes to change, when it comes time to break that addiction between thinking and feeling and break from the familiar self. Then the body, which has become the mind because of its cycle, tends to send signals back to the brain to cause the brain to return back to the familiar self. Every time we learn something new, we make a new connection in the brain. If we're talking about evolving the brain, there's two primary ways: learning text, or what's called semantic memories, learning facts and information. And as we begin to form new memories based on what we learn, the brain upscales its hardware to form a new stitch in the three-dimensional tapestry of gray matter. But when we have a new experience really enriches the brain, because when we're in the midst of a novel experience, not only are we gathering information just by what we're learning through fact, but our senses are completely evolved. And because our senses are so involved in the experience, it causes more neurons to begin to cluster together to reflect the event in the environment. So learning and experiencing are two great ways to evolve the brain. When we live in survival, we live by the chemicals of stress. And when we're threatened by anything in our external world, those survival chemicals, or those stress chemicals, mobilize enormous amounts of energy so that we're prepared to survive in the environment. So when we mobilize all that energy that's created chemically produces a very strong rush of emotion that tends to be somewhat addictive. And it's those emotional states that produce those emotions of anger and hatred and aggression and judgment and fear and anxiety and pain and suffering. And that's, according to the psychological model, 90% of most people's thoughts and emotions are negative. So the reason they're so easy and they're so negative is because those emotions drive us to a lower denominator. It causes us to focus our attention on the body, the environment, and time. We become selfish. To go from that addictive state into a creative state requires us to become selfless. And there's a very strong physiological change that takes place in the brain when we're in the creative mode. When we're in survival, it's the hindbrain that's controlling the forebrain. It's our feelings that are controlling our thinking. When we slip into a state of creation, we actually have the forebrain controlling the hindbrain. The frontal lobe acts like a great symphony leader, and it quiets down the rest of the circuits in the brain so that nothing else is being processed but what we're present with or what we're doing. The moment the forebrain controls the hindbrain, the frontal lobe acts like a volume control, and it lowers the volume to the circuits in the brain that process time and space. So the result of that is we forget about ourselves. We become selfless. We become nobody, no thing, and no time. That's the moment when we're in that selfless state that we're the most effective in terms of creation. That's when we break the addiction. Well, there are several ways to break these emotional patterns. I mean, there's a whole new science emerging in the United States called energy medicine or energy psychology. And what makes energy medicine and energy psychology, all the way from EMDR to EFT to network chiropractic to body talk to matrix energetics to reconnective therapy, they're all working with taking the memory out of the body. That's the key. And even meditation is a great tool. So the tools that I like are anything that helps to liberate the emotion out of the body, because that's where it exists. It doesn't really exist as much in the mind. It exists more in the body. So the meditative process that we use in my seminars and workshops are really designed to have the person address the emotion that they've memorized and then begin to unmemorize that emotion and then recondition the body to a new mind or to a new emotion. And the meditation that we do seems to be quite effective. According to the neuroscientific definition of mind and how it connects to the quantum field, mind is the brain in action, or mind is the brain at work. And because we have 100 billion neurons in our brain, we could make infinite different types of minds. Now, if we can change the brain and we can change the mind, it begs the question, who's doing the changing of the brain and the mind? The brain can't change the brain because it's just an organ, no different than a liver or a kidney. And the mind can't change the brain because mind is the product of the brain. So who's changing the brain and the mind? And that word is consciousness, that immaterial aspect of you and I that uses the brain and body to produce different levels of mind. And only when we're truly conscious and we're truly aware do we make measurable changes. So consciousness, the immaterial aspect of you and I that connects us to the field, is what operates the brain and body, and it is liaison that allows us to unify matter and energy.